It's August 2nd, 2026, and there's a 5-mile long strip of coral rock sitting in the Persian Gulf that has quietly decided the fate of an entire war. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Good to have you here tonight. We're diving straight into one of the single most consequential targets in this entire Iran conflict, a place most people had never even heard of 18 months ago, and now it might be the most important square mile of real estate on the planet, Kharg Island. So let's set the stage, because if you don't understand what Kharg actually is, none of the strikes, threats, and blockade drama of the last several months makes any sense. Kharg Island sits about 20 miles off the Iranian coast in the Persian Gulf. It's tiny, roughly 8 kilometers long, maybe half that wide, basically a glorified sandbar with some of the most valuable energy infrastructure on Earth bolted onto it. But here's the number that matters. Somewhere around 90% of Iran's crude oil exports flow through that island. 90%. Not 40, not 60, 90. Every barrel that keeps the Iranian regime funded, every dollar that pays for the IRGC's missile program, every rial that trickles down to keep the enforcers, the boots, and the bullets running. Almost all of it gets loaded onto tankers right there on Kharg. So when people ask why the United States keeps circling back to this one island over and over, instead of just flattening the whole country, this is why. You don't need to occupy a nation of 90 million people to bring it to its knees. You just need to choke the one artery keeping the whole body alive. And that's exactly what's been happening. Let's rewind, because this story didn't start yesterday. It's been building for months. Back on March 13th, 2026, the U.S. Air Force carried out its first major raid on the island, hitting more than 90 separate military sites while very deliberately avoiding the oil and gas infrastructure itself. Think about that for a second. American forces had the ability to turn Kharg's terminals into a smoking crater right then and there, and they chose not to. Trump posted that American forces had totally obliterated every military target on the island, and made a point of saying the actual oil facilities were left standing. Why would you do that? Because oil markets are global. Take Kharg's exports fully offline overnight, and you're not just hurting Iran, you're spiking prices at the pump in Ohio and Texas and everywhere else. So the strategy from the beginning has been surgical. Hit the air defenses, hit the radar sites, hit the military garrisons protecting the island, and leave the pipelines and storage tanks standing as leverage, as a threat hanging over Tehran's head like a guillotine that just hasn't dropped yet. Then in April, we got round two. New reporting came out, this time through Axios, citing a senior U.S. official confirming another wave of strikes on military targets across the island. Again, the pattern held. Hit the defenses, leave the oil alone. It's almost like watching someone slowly turn a dial instead of flipping a switch, and that's intentional. This is escalation management. You want Iran to feel the squeeze tightening every few weeks, without giving them the one thing that would make them feel like they have nothing left to lose. Because a regime with nothing left to lose is a genuinely dangerous regime. A regime that still has something on the table, something it's desperate to protect, is a regime you can actually pressure, maybe even negotiate with. Now here's where the picture gets murkier, and where a lot of the public confusion started. At various points, U.S. officials have stopped short of confirming exactly which strikes hit which targets in real time, even as Vice President Vance acknowledged the Kharg strikes had happened while insisting they didn't represent a change in strategy. Is that operational security while assessments were still being finalized? Possibly. Is it a genuine fog of war where different agencies are working off slightly different pictures of the same target set? Also possible. I won't pretend to know with certainty which specific strikes were fully confirmed versus walked back in the retelling, because the information out of this theater changes by the hour, and a lot of what's circulating online is edited, mislabeled, or flatly fabricated. What I can tell you is the pattern. Kharg keeps getting hit, whether every detail is confirmed in real time or not. And Iran keeps insisting its oil operations are running normally, while nearly every time, independent satellite imagery tells a very different story than Tehran state media. Which brings us to the psychological war being fought over this island, just as fascinating as the physical one. Every time Kharg gets struck, Iranian state-affiliated outlets go into overdrive, trying to convince their own population and the rest of the world that nothing really happened. Iran's semi-official Mehr news agency reported after the March strikes that the island's maritime infrastructure suffered little to no damage and continued operating as normal. Meanwhile, satellite imagery companies were putting out before and after shots telling a very different story. This is the same regime that has claimed the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed at points in this conflict, while independent tracking data showed Iran itself continuing to ship well over 1 million barrels a day out through the Gulf during roughly that same stretch. So, when Tehran says Kharg Island is fine, treat that with about the same trust you'd give a car salesman telling you the grinding noise from the transmission is actually a feature. Let's talk about why the Trump administration has been so fixated on this one target, because there's a strategic logic here that goes beyond generically wanting to hurt Iran's economy. Back on June 11th, Trump posted that the U.S. intended to hit Iran very hard and, in his words, seize Iran's energy base on Kharg Island as part of that effort, adding that the U.S. would eventually take Kharg and assume total control of Iran's oil and gas markets. Seize, not destroy. That's a different verb entirely. Multiple outlets ran with reporting that the administration had explored some kind of ground or marine operation to physically take control of the island. Would that actually happen? Occupying a foreign island in a hostile theater is an entirely different commitment than a bombing run. Holding ground, defending a perimeter, supplying a garrison sitting 21 miles off a coast that still has drone swarms, fast attack boats, and coastal defense missiles nearby. Not a decision anyone makes lightly. But even floating the idea publicly tells you Kharg isn't just a bombing target in the minds of some planners anymore. It's a strategic prize. Control the island processing 90% of a nation's oil exports, and you effectively hold the valve on its entire economy. Iran knows this, which is part of why there had been reports of the regime moving additional military personnel and air defense onto Kharg in anticipation of exactly this scenario. Let's get into the physical picture of what's actually sitting out there, because Kharg isn't some abstract pin on a map. You've got the Falat Iran Oil Company facilities, which alone can move something in the range of 500,000 barrels of crude a day. You've got the Kharg Petrochemical Company's operations. You've got pipeline networks running under the Gulf floor, connecting the island back to Iran's major onshore oil fields. This isn't some improvised smuggling setup. It's decades of infrastructure investment, built specifically because Kharg's deep water access lets massive tankers dock and load without navigating the shallower waters closer to the mainland. It's engineering built for one purpose: moving as much oil as physically possible, as fast as possible, out to the rest of the world. Here's something a lot of people don't realize. This isn't even the first time in modern history Kharg has been on the receiving end of a sustained bombing campaign. Back in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein's forces repeatedly targeted the island because Iraqi planners understood exactly what American planners understand now: that you pressure a petrostate by going after the export terminal, not by grinding through its entire standing army one unit at a time. Geography never changes, even when the political alliances around it do. Let's shift to the broader blockade, because Kharg doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's tied directly into the fight over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has repeatedly claimed it effectively closed the strait to international shipping, and each time, that claim gets undercut within about 24 hours by actual tanker traffic. U.S. Central Command has been documenting enforcement in real time, redirecting, disabling, and boarding vessels attempting to run the blockade, while letting humanitarian shipments through. That enforcement extended directly to Kharg-bound traffic too. U.S. forces struck and disabled an oil tanker attempting to reach the island in defiance of the blockade after ignoring repeated warnings. That's not an accident, that's enforcement, and a clear signal that anyone trying to keep Kharg's export pipeline flowing under the table is going to get caught doing it. Here's what makes this whole situation so uniquely dangerous, and I want you to really sit with this for a second. Oil is fungible, but leverage isn't. Every time the United States hits military targets around Kharg while sparing the actual oil infrastructure, it's sending a message that reads less like an ultimatum and more like a countdown clock. Trump has said as much publicly, warning that Iran's oil infrastructure would be next if Tehran keeps escalating and keeps refusing to open the strait on its own terms. That's the entire game right there. It's not really about permanently denying Iran oil revenue, at least not yet. It's about using the threat of denying that revenue as the single biggest bargaining chip on the table. You flicker someone's lights a little bit at a time, and eventually they come to the table to stop the flickering before you cut the whole grid. Let's talk for a second about why Kharg specifically became the choke point instead of one of Iran's other export terminals. Iran has smaller facilities scattered along its coastline, but none come close to matching Kharg's throughput capacity. Deep water access is the massive factor. The really large crude carriers that haul 2 million barrels in a single trip need serious draft depth to dock and load safely, and Kharg was specifically engineered decades ago with exactly that kind of vessel in mind. You can't simply redirect that volume to a shallower port and expect the same throughput. The physics doesn't allow for an easy workaround. So when planners identified Kharg as the priority target, it was the logical output of understanding exactly how Iran's export architecture is built. Cut the head off this one snake, and the rest of the body genuinely struggles to compensate. There's also a comparison worth making to other global oil choke points, because Kharg fits into a bigger pattern of how modern conflicts increasingly revolve around a handful of geographic pinch points. The Strait of Hormuz itself is the most obvious example, with a significant share of the world's daily oil supply passing through it. But Kharg is different. It's not a shipping lane multiple nations depend on. It's a single point of failure belonging entirely to one country's economy. That makes it in some ways an even more attractive target from a pure military logic standpoint, since degrading it doesn't require the same level of international coordination that comes with threatening to close an international waterway used by dozens of nations. It's surgical in a way a strait closure never could be. Let's talk about how Iran has responded, because the rhetoric out of Tehran has followed a pretty predictable script. Officials accuse the United States and its allies of escalating a conflict Iran itself keeps reigniting through proxy attacks and straight threats, then issue vague warnings about retaliation against anyone Tehran considers to be shielding American aggression. It's almost comedic watching a regime that's been launching drone and missile attacks on Gulf neighbors and threatening to mine an international waterway turn around and accuse everyone else of being the aggressor. The geopolitical equivalent of someone starting a bar fight, getting knocked out, and telling the bartender they were the real victim. We've seen this playbook before elsewhere in this conflict too. Fake footage claiming to show massive retaliatory strikes that turns out to be recycled or outright AI generated, and grand claims that never get substantiated. Apply a healthy dose of skepticism to anything claiming to be dramatic new footage out of this theater. The information war around Kharg is arguably as intense as the kinetic one. So where does this actually leave things strategically? Let's zoom all the way out, because I think this is where the real four-dimensional chess is happening. Iran's entire economic survival strategy for the last several decades has hinged on being able to move oil out through Kharg, regardless of sanctions, regardless of diplomatic isolation, regardless of pretty much anything the West has thrown at it. Iran has built an entire shadow fleet system specifically to keep that revenue flowing, even under maximum pressure sanctions regimes. And independent tanker tracking data has shown Iran continuing to ship well over 1 million barrels a day, even during the most intense stretches of this war. Kharg is the one choke point that shadow fleet cannot route around, because it's not a sanctions loophole problem, it's a physical infrastructure problem. You cannot smuggle 90% of a nation's oil exports through back channels. The volume simply doesn't work that way. Which means, as long as Kharg remains a viable, functioning export hub, Iran has a lifeline. And as long as the United States keeps demonstrating the willingness and capability to strike it whenever it chooses, that lifeline effectively operates on borrowed time, dependent entirely on Washington's patience. It's also worth understanding how sophisticated Iran's workaround network has become, because it didn't develop overnight. It's the product of decades of sanctions pressure forcing the regime to get creative, ship-to-ship transfers out in open water, flag switching, transponder spoofing where a vessel's tracking signal is made to say it's somewhere it isn't, and layers of shell companies obscuring who actually owns a given tanker and where its cargo originated. But all of that sophistication still depends on having a functioning loading point to begin with. You can disguise a tanker's identity all day long, but you still need somewhere physical to fill it up, and that keeps bringing everything back to the same island, no matter how many shell companies get layered on top of the transaction. This is why I think the administration has been so deliberate about not fully destroying the oil infrastructure yet, even while repeatedly hitting the military targets protecting it. It's not mercy, let's be clear. It's leverage management. Destroy the oil terminals completely, and you've removed your best bargaining chip in one move, and guaranteed a genuinely desperate regime with nothing left to lose, still sitting on a stockpile of ballistic missiles. Keep threatening it instead, keep circling it, keep hitting everything around it while leaving the actual prize dangling just out of reach, and you maintain maximum pressure without forcing the worst-case scenario. It's a razor-thin line to walk, and impressive from a pure strategy standpoint, even setting aside how you feel about the broader conflict. But here's the real risk. Leverage only works as long as the other side believes you're actually willing to pull the trigger. If Tehran concludes the United States will never actually go all the way because of the global economic fallout that would follow, the threat loses its teeth. That's exactly why we keep seeing these periodic strikes on the military infrastructure around Kharg, each one a reminder, a proof of capability, a way of saying, we can still reach you, and the next step is always on the table. Let's talk for a second about what a full-scale strike on the oil infrastructure itself would actually mean, because the ripple effects would be immediate and massive. You're talking about knocking out a facility handling crude flows in the hundreds of thousands of barrels a day at minimum. Global oil markets do not like uncertainty, and they especially do not like supply shocks out of a region that already accounts for a huge share of the world's proven reserves and shipping lanes. Prices at the pump would move, and they'd move fast, and that's exactly the kind of economic and political blowback that makes Washington think twice before pulling that particular trigger, even with a hostile regime sitting on the other end of it. It's a genuinely difficult balancing act between maximum pressure on Tehran and minimum disruption to the global economy, and honestly, I don't think there's a clean answer to threading that needle perfectly. Let's also touch on how Iran's Gulf neighbors are reading this, because their reaction tells you a lot about how seriously the region takes the card pressure campaign. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have their own oil infrastructure sitting relatively close by and have stayed on heightened alert, watching for any sign Iran might lash out at regional targets if Kharg keeps taking hits. Iranian military command has issued warnings naming ports and facilities linked to American operations as potential retaliation targets, exactly the kind of statement that puts every country hosting U.S. assets on edge. Debris from intercepted projectiles has already come down in cities like Dubai, thankfully without serious injury, a clear reminder that when a conflict escalates around a single choke point like this, the shockwaves don't stay contained to the two primary combatants.